I was 92 years old, lying in a hospital bed with a fever that had climbed to dangerous levels, and none of my 3 children came. The nurse told me she had contacted all 3 numbers on file the evening I was admitted. She had left messages for each of them. She had indicated the situation was serious. None of them appeared that night, and none appeared the following morning. On the 3rd day, a volunteer named Rose brought me water and asked if there was anyone she should call. I told her I would handle it myself. Lying in that bed, more alone than I had been in 9 decades of living, I made a decision that was quiet and clear and entirely final. I recovered, and then I called my lawyer. But to understand what I did after leaving that hospital, you need to understand what came before it, and what kind of man I was before that bed showed me something I had been refusing to see clearly. This is not a story about bitterness. It is a story about a man who gave everything he had to the people around him, who lay alone through 3 dangerous nights while his children went about their ordinary lives, and who recovered with a clarity he had never felt before about what the years he still had remaining were actually for. The physical recovery took 9 days. The other recovery, the one that required a different kind of work, began the morning I walked through my front door and sat down at the desk where I had worked for 50 years. Before I continue, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. Leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from, whether you are nearby or on the other side of the planet. If you have ever felt the weight of being invisible to people who were supposed to love you, people whose entire foundation was built on what you provided across a lifetime, this story will reach something you already know. You are not alone in that experience. This community exists because these things happen inside families that look completely fine from the outside, and because the truth about them deserves to be spoken honestly. Thank you for being here. Now let me tell you what I decided in that hospital bed and what I did about it. My name is Edmund. I am 92 years old. I was a physician for 50 years, specializing in internal medicine. I worked in hospital settings and in private practice, and retired at 80 after receiving a recognition from my medical association for contributions to the field I had spent my professional life in. My wife Vera died 8 years ago, and with her went the last person who knew my full history without needing anything explained. We had 3 children together: Christopher, my eldest, my daughter Margot, and my youngest son Daniel. Each of them built a good professional life. I say this without resentment. Their professional success was real, and it was partly built on foundations that Vera and I spent 4 decades constructing for them. That context matters for what follows. After Vera died, the 3 children established a visiting rotation. Each appeared roughly every 4 to 6 weeks. The visits were not unpleasant, but they had a quality that I identified over time as maintenance rather than connection. They checked the house, spoke briefly about my health and plans, and left with the efficient manner of people completing an obligation they considered both necessary and mildly inconvenient. I said nothing about this observation because I was not certain it was accurate, and because I did not want to judge incorrectly. I lived alone, managed my affairs, read extensively in the evenings, walked when the weather permitted. I told myself I was grateful for the visits I received. The hospital would eventually show me what gratitude had been obscuring. The Victorian house Vera and I had shared for 51 years was a property with a history that preceded us. My grandfather had purchased it, my father had maintained it, and I had renovated it substantially across the decades we lived there. The renovation decisions were all made with Vera. The kitchen we redesigned when the children were still young, the study I built for my medical reference library, the garden Vera had tended with the same precision she brought to everything she loved. The house was registered in my name. I had never transferred any portion of it to anyone. After Vera died, the house was the place where I still felt closest to the shape of the life we had built together. The estate beyond the house included financial assets accumulated across 50 years of medical practice and invested with the conservative patience of a man who had watched too many colleagues spend freely and arrive at the end of their working lives with insufficient resources for the years that followed. I had structured my finances carefully, reviewed them regularly, and maintained them with the same discipline I had applied to my professional responsibilities. My existing will divided everything equally among the 3 children, a provision Vera and I had made when we were young enough to believe that equal distribution reflected and would reinforce equal relationship. I had never revisited that assumption. I carried it into the hospital on the night of my admission and examined it carefully across 3 nights alone. The collection of first edition medical texts I had assembled across 50 years of practice was both monetarily valuable and personally significant in a way that the monetary value did not fully capture. Each volume represented a period in the development of the field I had devoted my life to, and finding and acquiring them had been the serious hobby of my professional years. Vera had understood this. She had given me 3 of the most important volumes as gifts across our marriage. The collection was housed in my study, which was also the room where I had made the phone call to Bernard the morning after I returned from the hospital. Standing in that room that morning, I had looked at those shelves and understood very clearly what I intended to do next. The hospitalization occurred in November. A respiratory infection had escalated quickly, as respiratory infections will in a man of 92, and the ambulance had been called by my neighbor Margaret, who heard me through the shared wall of our houses during a night when the coughing had become alarming. I arrived at the hospital by ambulance, was admitted to an internal medicine unit, and by the following morning had a fever chart that concerned the attending physician. The nurse who managed my care that first night took my emergency contact information from the form I completed on admission and called all 3 numbers listed. She confirmed this to me the following morning when I asked why no one had appeared. She said she had left messages for all 3. She had been clear that the situation was serious. Christopher's explanation arrived by phone on the 3rd day. He had received the message but had a significant professional presentation the following morning and had decided the situation would likely resolve without requiring his immediate presence. He said I had managed difficult periods before without them needing to be there. That sentence told me something I had been declining to understand clearly. Margot had been traveling for a conference and had seen the message only on her return. The timing created a window of 2 full days during which a message about her 92-year-old father in hospital with a dangerous fever had been visible to her and had not produced a change in plan. Daniel's wife had received the call. He had not understood the severity. That explanation required me to believe he had not asked his wife to clarify what the call had described. Christopher arrived on the 4th day, by which time the fever had broken and the immediate danger had passed. He brought flowers and stood at the foot of the bed with the expression people wear when they have behaved badly and are hoping the person they behaved badly toward will make the reconciliation easy for them. I did not make it easy. I did not make it difficult either. I spoke to him about the treatment, thanked him for coming, and watched his expression for signs that the 3 days he had missed were registering as something significant to him. They were registering as inconvenient rather than significant. The difference between those 2 responses was something I noted carefully. I was already composing in my mind the call I intended to make to Bernard the following week. Margot arrived on the 5th day. She was warm in the way she was always warm when a situation required warmth from her. She had brought a book she had found at an airport. She sat beside the bed for an hour and described her conference, her children, her upcoming schedule. She did not ask what the nights had been like. She did not ask whether I had been frightened or what I had thought about during the hours when the fever was highest and no one had appeared. Her conversation had the quality of someone covering the surface of a visit without making contact with what the visit was about. When she left, she kissed my forehead and said she would call soon. I thanked her for coming and then asked the nurse for paper and made careful notes. Daniel arrived last, on the 6th day, with his wife and their youngest child. The child was restless and needed managing throughout the visit. Daniel asked how I was feeling, whether the doctors had explained the recovery plan, whether I needed anything arranged when I was discharged. He asked these questions with the efficiency of someone completing a list of appropriate things to say. He did not ask how I had spent the 3 days before they came. He did not ask what it had felt like to lie there with a dangerous fever and no family present. He did not look at me the way a person looks at someone who has been ill and alone and genuinely frightened. He looked at me the way a person looks at something that has been checked. The visit was 22 minutes. I was discharged on the 9th day. Margaret, my neighbor, drove me home. She had visited me twice during the hospitalization and had been present for a total of more than 4 hours across those visits. She had asked questions that required real answers. She had listened to those answers. In the car on the way home, she asked how I was feeling and whether there was anything she should know about my care in the first week after discharge. Those questions were the most medically appropriate and personally attentive questions anyone had asked me during the 9 days. The woman who had called the ambulance, visited twice, and driven me home was my neighbor. The people who had not come on the first night were my children. That comparison did not require further analysis. I called Bernard that first Monday morning after my return home. Bernard had been my lawyer for 30 years. He had handled Vera's estate, multiple property transactions, and the professional liability matters that arise across a long medical career. I told him I needed to revise my will. I told him I was in full possession of my faculties, that I had passed my most recent medical evaluation without concern, and that I was prepared to commission a formal neurological assessment if he considered it advisable for the purposes of protecting the document from future challenge. Bernard said a formal assessment would be wise, given my age, and given that the revision would represent a significant change from the existing document. He said he could see me that Thursday. I said I would be there. The neurological evaluation was conducted by Dr. Chen, a specialist I had worked alongside for many years during my practice. He administered a comprehensive cognitive assessment across 2 appointments. The assessment covered memory, language, reasoning, executive function, processing speed, and spatial orientation. At the follow-up appointment, Dr. Chen provided his written report. The findings were unambiguous. I was cognitively intact. My scores were within normal range across every domain assessed. My capacity to make informed decisions about my affairs was not in question in any measurable way. I thanked Dr. Chen for his thoroughness. He said the assessment had been unnecessary from a clinical perspective, but that he understood the legal value of having it contemporaneously documented. I told him that was precisely why I had requested it. Bernard and I spent the next 2 full sessions reviewing the existing will and rebuilding it from the ground up. The existing document had been written by a man who assumed that love and presence were the same thing, that the children he had spent his life providing for would be present when presence mattered most. 3 nights in a hospital bed had removed that assumption completely and permanently. The revised will reflected an honest assessment of the relationships as they actually existed. The estate was redistributed toward purposes I believed in. A medical foundation focused on respiratory illness research, the hospital library at my former institution which remained chronically underfunded, a scholarship fund for medical students from low-income backgrounds, and a meaningful bequest to Margaret, who had called the ambulance and driven me home. I said nothing to my children about the revisions. Life continued as it had before. Christopher called at his 3-week intervals. Margot called when she was between other commitments. Daniel called on my birthday and at the significant holidays. The calls were pleasant and unremarkable. I answered each one with the same warmth I had always offered. None of them asked about my recovery in any depth that suggested they had considered what the 3 days alone might have meant. None of them asked what I had thought about, or how the nights had felt, or whether the experience had changed anything in my understanding of my situation. They had returned to their established patterns, as if the hospitalization had been a minor interruption in a routine that would otherwise continue unchanged. Bernard filed the completed will with the accompanying neurological report on a Thursday morning in March, approximately 4 months after the hospitalization. The document was properly witnessed, notarized, and registered. It would withstand any future challenge. Dr. Chen's assessment made the competency question unanswerable for any party who might later attempt to argue it. The beneficiary designations reflected my actual relationships and my actual values, rather than the assumptions I had carried since the years when Vera and I had been young enough to believe that the families we were building would remain what they were when we were building them. The revision was done. I went home and made lunch. I resumed my ordinary days with a sense of clarity I had not felt in some time. Margaret came to see me 3 weeks after my discharge, with a casserole and the easy company of someone who had no agenda beyond the visit itself. She asked how I was managing. She asked whether the nights were difficult. She asked questions that required real engagement, and she listened to the answers with the quality of attention that real questions deserve. I told her I was grateful she had called the ambulance, and that her presence during the hospitalization had meant more than I could easily quantify. She said she would have done the same for any neighbor. I thought about that sentence for a long time after she left. Any neighbor. It contained a comparison that I did not make aloud, but that I had already reflected in the document Bernard had filed the previous week. The scholarship fund Bernard established in the revised will was to carry Vera's name. This was the provision I had been clearest about from the earliest stages of the revision process. Vera had believed deeply in medicine as a vocation and had spent her career as a nurse before our children required her to shift her professional focus. She had spoken throughout our marriage about the students she had met who had the intelligence and the commitment, but not the financial resources that medical training required. A scholarship carrying her name, funding students she would have recognized and believed in, was the form of permanence I could give her that no other instrument provided. Bernard noted the provision when we reviewed the final document. He said it was a fitting thing. I agreed. The bequest to the hospital library reflected 50 years of understanding how underfunded institutional libraries constrain the development of physicians who cannot afford to purchase the reference materials their training requires. I had used that library throughout my career. I had donated books to it on several occasions. The library staff had known me for decades. When I called to speak with the head librarian about the provision Bernard was including in the will, she was quiet for a moment, and then said the collection I had described funding would change what her library could offer to every student who trained at that institution for the next generation. I told her I hoped that was true. I believed it was. The Respiratory Illness Foundation was the choice that came directly from the experience that had prompted the entire revision. I had lain in a hospital bed with a respiratory infection that could have killed me, and had thought, in the long hours of the second night, about the research that might have produced better treatments for the condition I was experiencing. I had spent my career in internal medicine, and I understood the gap between what current treatment options provided and what more targeted research might eventually make possible. Directing a portion of what I had accumulated toward that gap was the most direct possible use of a lesson that 3 nights in a hospital bed had taught me at 92. The foundation's work would outlast me. That was the point. My children continued calling at their intervals through the months following the revision, unaware that the document they had presumably been assuming would transfer a significant estate to them equally had been fundamentally changed. Christopher called and described his professional projects with the enthusiasm of a man who has not recently had reason to reassess his assumptions. Margot sent a photograph of her garden. Daniel called on the birthday with a cheerful message about my health and his family. The calls were warm in the way calls are warm when the people making them believe the relationship is functioning as they expect. I answered each one with the same attention I had always given. Nothing in my manner gave them reason to ask questions they were not asking. None of them asked, across all those months of regular contact, about the experience of the 3 nights in the hospital. They had processed the hospitalization as a resolved medical event. They had visited, satisfied the obligation of presence, and returned to their lives. What they had not done was consider what those 3 nights might have meant to me or what I might have thought during them. A person who has spent 50 years in medicine and who lies alone with a dangerous fever at 92 in a hospital bed with 3 contact numbers on file and no family appearing, thinks about things that are clarifying. The clarity I arrived at across those 3 nights was not anger, though the anger was real. It was something cooler and more precise. It was understanding. My children will learn about the revised will after my death, which is when wills are read. I am writing this now, while I am still here, so that it exists in my own words and my own voice. I know what Christopher will say when the document is read to him. I know what Margot will feel. I know Daniel will be silent for a long time before he speaks. I have thought about all of this carefully, and my conscience is entirely clear. I did not revise the will from bitterness or spite. I revised it in the full clarity that arrives when you have lain alone through 3 nights at 92 and understood, without the possibility of continued misunderstanding, what your relationships actually are rather than what you had been telling yourself they were. The hospital had given me something I had not been seeking: permission to be accurate. Permission to stop measuring my relationships against what I had hoped they would be, and to measure them instead against what they had shown themselves to be across the years, and most precisely, across 3 specific nights in November. The revision was not a punishment, and I did not frame it to Bernard as one. It was a correction of a document that had been based on assumptions that were no longer accurate. The law provides for exactly this: a competent adult directing their estate according to their actual understanding of their situation, properly documented and registered. I had done precisely that. The document was correct in a way the previous one had not been. Margaret continues to visit on Thursday afternoons. We share tea and conversation that has the easy quality of time spent with someone who expects nothing from you except your actual company. She has asked about Vera. She has asked about my years in practice. She has asked about the books in my study with genuine curiosity about the history they contain. These conversations have a texture that I find, in the years remaining to me, to be the most valuable thing I can spend an afternoon on. A neighbor who calls an ambulance and visits twice during a 9-day hospitalization and drives you home on discharge day and then comes for tea on Thursdays is a person who has demonstrated something over time. I have never been able to document human character professionally, but I recognize it when I see it. I still live in this house. I sit at the desk where I worked for 50 years. I read in the evenings in the chair where Vera used to sit beside me with her own book, each of us in our separate reading, connected by the comfortable presence that long marriages build when they are built correctly. The garden she tended is tended now by Margaret, who asked if she might take over the maintenance of the plots Vera had developed. I said yes without hesitation. The oak Vera planted 20 years ago is in full growth this year. She would have been glad about it. The garden carries her patience and her intention in every bed and border, and I find walking through it in the evenings one of the better things remaining in my days. What I did was a correction, not cruelty. No law was broken. No person was harmed. The document was executed by a legally competent adult, documented by a neurological evaluation that would survive any professional challenge, witnessed and registered according to all requirements. I made decisions about what I had accumulated across a lifetime of work and directed those decisions toward purposes I believe in. The Respiratory Illness Foundation will fund research. The library will serve students. The scholarship will carry Vera's name. The estate will do the work I intended it to do. My children will receive less than they expected. That outcome reflects the truth of what happened in November, rather than the assumption I had been carrying before November showed me the difference. I am 92 years old, and I made a significant decision about my estate clearly, deliberately, and without regret. The clarity that 3 nights in a hospital bed produced was not a small thing. It was the kind of clarity that arrives when circumstances remove every comfortable assumption and show you what is actually there. What was actually there was a neighbor who called the ambulance, and a doctor who assessed my mind, and a lawyer who prepared the document correctly, and 3 children who did not come. I have acted according to what I found when I looked clearly. Before you go, I want to ask you one question. If you had been in that hospital room through 3 nights alone, and you had recovered with complete clarity about what your relationships actually were, what would you have done? Would you have forgiven and carried on as before? Tell me below.